In China's case, is the ability to seduce, persuade, or reassure. Under Joseph Nye's formulation, a nation's soft power is its ability to achieve goals through its attractive rather than coercive power, and it derives from the perceived legitimacy of institutions and the attractiveness of culture, the desire of other countries to interact with or to emulate another nation. I talked about this a little bit at this session last year, and we ended with predictions for the coming year, and so I wanted to return to my prediction, which wasn't really a prediction or prophecy, it was more an intuition, that we might be seeing a shift in some of the flow of soft power style influence between the United States. And since we established relations with China in 1979, the overwhelming weight of influence, culture, science and technology, academia, media, fashion, tastes, has been from the United States to China. There's no point in trying to put a number on this. It would be an artificial exercise, but most of you have been to China, and you feel this at the street level. The United States has had far more impact, deeper and broader on China, than China has had on the United States. And last year I said that maybe 2016 might be the year in which China, being to some degree saturated, not dissatisfied with American influence, but saturated, we might begin to see a shift in that flow. And I see this shift in influence happening not because of China's increasing military power or its military ambitions, or even primarily because of its influence on international regimes, but because of China's purchasing power and the shift that Joanna was describing. It's the world's largest market. And I noted, that we saw in January of this year, the Hurun Index said that China has now more US dollar billionaires than the United States. That's not the important statistic. The more important statistic, according to Credit Suisse, in a 2015 analysis, was that China now has a larger middle class, more people with between $50,000 and $500,000 US of income every year. And it is this purchasing power that makes China not only the biggest market in the way that we usually talk about it, but increasingly a tastemaker to the world. And so it is that, the vectors of money primarily, but also people, that have the potential to increase China's soft power. And I want to talk about it both in the US-China context, but also worldwide. One of the things that this market and this purchasing power does for China is what Joanna just mentioned several times, is China's ability to scale up relatively rapidly. And that holds tremendous both hard and soft power implications. Every morning when I come in here to the Wilson Center, I get off the bus up by Capitol Hill and I walk across the mall and along Constitution Avenue, where every morning I read a quote on a couple of the US government placards out there that comes from the late 19th, early 20th century American architect and planner Daniel Burnham, who played a role in the development of Washington. And Burnham said this, you can read it on the plaques: "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram, planning, once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Remember that our sons and our grandsons, and granddaughters we might add now, are going to do things that would stagger us. Let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty." So make no little plans. China's got this. China is making big plans in ways that I think have enormous implications for China's influence going forward. Let's just look at the past year. In China, in June of 2016, China once again built the world's fastest supercomputer, replacing the world's previous fastest supercomputer, which was also Chinese. What's different about this latest fastest supercomputer is that it uses indigenous chips of Chinese manufacture, and for the first time, no US hardware. In July of 2016, China completed the world's biggest radio telescope in Guizhou. In August of 2016, China sent the world's first quantum communications satellite into orbit. This is a new technology that has enormous implications both for communications, which are potentially hack-free, but it has military implications as well. According to November 2016 data, looking at 2015 patent applications, there were 2.9 million patents issued worldwide. China filed over 1 million of them, while the US was at slightly over 500,000. Now there's a major issue here of the quality. A lot of these Chinese patents are what are called design patents, incremental and sometimes really irrelevant minor tweaks to existing technologies. China doesn't yet have a transformative technology patent, and they are limited in scale, and that China, of those over 1 million patents, China only filed 42,000 patent applications outside of China's borders, where the applications are higher, whereas the US had over 238,000 of its 500,000 patents overseas. Still, the trend lines are worth noticing. We have tended in the US to poo-poo a lot of this work and filing for patent applications because we know that they're not world-changing, and we know, furthermore, that there's a push-on for propaganda reasons to file patents, and people get, academics can get a boost in their careers. And so we've tended to say, no, China is still not an innovative nation because it is not free. This is America's great advantage, again, both in hard and soft power realms. But is that true? Again, China's purchasing power. China has been on a buying spree in Silicon Valley, buying new and innovative companies. Does it matter going forward if, because of its social and political systems and because of the continued weaknesses in China's educational system, does it matter if China cannot produce innovative scientists, if it can simply buy innovation? So China, again, is scaling up. Add to that the issues that Richard has already mentioned. The influence China gets through investment, through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, One Belt, One Road, and China's other increased provision of global public goods. Very important. China now provides more soldiers to the UN peacekeepers, the Blue Helmets, than any other country. China plays a key role in fighting global pandemics. It played a big role in fighting Ebola. So China is able, again, through purchasing power. We tend to focus in the South China Sea on anti-access area denial, China's hard power. But really, I suspect that this has bigger long-term implications for the United States. A few years ago, Michael Lampton at Johns Hopkins SAIS wrote a book called The Three Faces of Chinese Power: Might, Money, and Minds. And when he looked forward at China's ability to develop its own power, hard and soft, later on, acknowledging the difficulties China faces, one of Lampton's conclusions was, I'd put my money on money. It makes a big difference. We need to pay a little bit more attention to that. And we are. And so one of the things that I'd like to talk about today is a shift, which both of you alluded to in different ways, in a fundamental Washington strategic disposition toward China. Awareness of the power of Chinese investment, the attractive power of its markets, and the ways that this can be used to build hard and soft power is shifting the way that we view China here in Washington, D.C. And I think that that is reasonable. One of the implications of this looking forward is I think we really need to drop the whole developing country lens when we look at China. China is a developing country. Now, of course, this is true. It's true that China is a developing country. And this is enormously important within China's borders. There are still many poor people, and the United States should do nothing but applaud the continued lifting of these people out of poverty as a matter of sympathy for fellow human beings. But when we look at the balance of power for the United States and China, I would argue it no longer matters to the United States that China is a developing country. Because within this developing country, as I've mentioned, there is a larger developed country than the United States, which is going to set world trends and set world tastes. Furthermore, China, because of its political system, even though its total economy is still probably smaller than that of the United States, China is able to put a larger proportion of its assets at the service of strategic goals than is the United States. So given those two things, does it matter to the United States that China is still a developing country? I would say really it doesn't. That's not a useful frame. So looking again now at sort of U.S.-China mutual influence, and I apologize for chattering. You talked about the polar vortex. It's still going on the stage. We are all right under the blowers from our air system. And I don't know how you feel, but it's freezing cold up here. So I'm aware that I'm chattering a little bit. And when we speak about mutual influence between the United States and China, I do not mean to imply that increased Chinese influence in America or worldwide is necessarily insidious. It can be extremely helpful. It can be very enriching culturally as well as monetarily, as well as spiritually. So I've spent most of my career working on cultural relations. I don't mean, and much of what I'm about to say has a somewhat negative sound to it, but I don't mean to discard the very positive impacts that China has always had on the United States and vice versa, and I think that those are going to continue. But the nature of them is changing. One of the ways that China's influence is changing is we're seeing ever more Chinese investment in the United States. This has been tracked, I think, most helpfully by Dan Rosen and his team at the Rhodium Group. China now has more year-on-year direct investment in the United States than the United States has year-on-year in China. Our cumulative investment in China is much higher than China's here. China directly employs about 100,000 United States citizens here on our territory. But we're starting to see now worry about that, again, at the Washington level. And I'll come back in a minute to why I keep emphasizing Washington. As Chinese companies have begun to acquire more American properties, we are seeing more calls in Washington for the use of reciprocity, the invocation of reciprocity in U.S.-China relations. And this is the old Ross Perot formula. It's very simple, as he said in his campaign speeches. I'll give you the same deal you gave me. What's wrong with that? Should reciprocity be a test for Chinese purchases? If a Chinese company wishes to purchase an American asset, there's the national security test under CFIUS, but there's also what would seem to be a fair question. Could an American company purchase the corresponding company in China? The answer is almost always no. Therefore, why should that be allowed to happen here? So more calls for the expansion of CFIUS. Just last month, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which is a congressional commission, non-binding recommendation, said that China's state-owned enterprises should no longer be allowed to purchase American assets as a matter of national security, because China's state-owned enterprises could use technologies they acquired to benefit China's national interests, quote, to the detriment of U.S. national security. Now notice that the same logic which says don't let Chinese SOEs buy American properties is easily extended to Chinese private companies. The same logic applies. A Chinese private company is not the same thing as an American private company. China works through national champions which will not make any major moves which defy the wishes of Beijing. That applies to a Huawei or an Alibaba or anybody else. So this logic that because we are in a long-term strategic competition with China, therefore any Chinese purchase of an asset is a threat to national security through a very, very broad lens. CFIUS to date has taken a narrow lens. There are calls now to broaden that out. Now, I keep emphasizing Washington because this Washington strategic concern, in my experience, and I think it's in the data, is not shared in American localities. States, cities, and counties are extremely welcoming of Chinese investment where it is tremendously beneficial locally and is actually saving some local companies and therefore local towns. At the same time, I said Chinese vectors for Chinese influence are not only money, but also people who are coming here in ever higher numbers for education. 300,000 this year, including a growing number of people at the high school level. Chinese are coming here to buy real estate. They're coming as tourists. They're coming to invest. They're coming to work. And again, throughout the United States, this is welcome and is seen very much as a positive thing. Now, in the soft power context, it's interesting to ask, with all these flood of Chinese, money, but also people into the United States in all sorts of ways, is that an example of American soft power or Chinese soft power? Who is influencing whom, and does it matter? This is why I said soft power is kind of a squishy concept. You put pressure on it, and you're not sure who wins with that. Another aspect of China's increasing soft power or influence here through money has to do with American pursuit of profits in China. And there's a piece I did for the LA Times out front about this. Because China now is the world's largest market, American companies are manufacturing to Chinese specifications. And this is true in things like communications technologies and cell phones. If you don't want to manufacture to different standards for every single country, which is expensive, you manufacture to the standards of your primary market. And that is increasingly China, whose standards, even for technologies, serve the desire of the Beijing government for control. And more products for sale in the United States feature those same technologies for reasons of economic efficiency. This is changing what you buy. We also see it in the area of creative standards, most strikingly with Hollywood. China, their box market growth has slowed down a little bit. It's now thought that about 2019, China will have the world's biggest box office. And therefore, you've got to, if you want to have a blockbuster, you want your movie to play in China. That means that you self-censor in order to get your movie approved by the Chinese government-run various, but one particular, the state administration of, and they keep changing it. It used to be arts, radio, film, and television, but now it's also,
I remember
it's got some P's in front of it, right. But now it's SPARF. It's a very flatulent acronym. I can't ever remember what it is. Anyway, they set the standards, and when you make a movie to meet those standards to show in China, China is given a direct channel for the export of its censorship regime to the United States, and it influences what you see in the multiplex. The same logic will also increasingly extend to publishing, where China is going to be the world's largest book market, again, highly censored. And if you want to be able to get your book published in China, you're going to have to self-censor. It's also true of gaming. And remember that the gaming industry is more profitable, has been for a long time, than Hollywood. And so we see growing calls from Congress in the past year for CFIUS, an extension of CFIUS rules. 16 congressmen signed a letter saying that China shouldn't be able to purchase any American soft power assets. This is a new change here in DC. This comes very close to our adopting a Chinese or a Russian concept of what they call, but we have never called, cultural security, 文化安全. And I would argue that adopting that kind of mindset is potentially extremely dangerous to the health of our own culture. Our argument has always been that American openness is its strength and that we mustn't adopt the paranoid style or censor other countries here because of fear of our cultural security. That is to adopt their style and to ultimately harm ourselves. That's been a very strong argument to date. But now when we've got this, something we've never faced before, which we face with China, we have a country of extremely high strategic concern, which is also a major market. That has never been true before, and we don't know how to deal with it. So the concern for the erosion of our freedoms and creative freedoms is real, I would argue, even as we have to be very careful about letting Congress, God forbid, set the rules for what happens culturally in the United States, even as we must be very careful about not adopting these standards of cultural freedom, cultural security. And these worries are highlighted, I think, are exacerbated by the fact that under Xi Jinping, China has been closing its door to American corporations, to American NGOs, to American academic influence, to American cultural influence. That heightens the contrast. It tends to heighten our fears. So in summary, we just had James Fallows, who knows quite a bit about China and has generally been very supportive of increased U.S.-China interaction, just published a piece in this month's Atlantic, I think it's the cover story, called China's Great Leap Backward. And he starts in his opening paragraph, he says this, he says, "What if China is going bad? Since early last year, I have been asking people inside and outside China versions of this question. By bad, I don't mean morally. Moral and ethical factors obviously matter in foreign policy, but I'm talking about something different." Actually, he's not. He's talking about morally. If you read the article, he really does mean bad. And this plays into this general sense that we see now strategically, and I think we would have seen it under a Clinton or a Trump presidency. But this growing sense that, yes, we cooperate with China, but we have to be realistic and recognize that it looms as a strategic and ideological competitor. And I think that that's one of the big changes that we're going to see. And so we see pressures in Washington, but not at the localities, to rather than engaging with China for our mutual good, to disengage as a matter of self-defense. And in closing, I would say that I think at the Kissinger Institute, while we're going to continue to talk about this, I think that this is a very perilous move. It's in many ways, it's a Chinese move. It's a walling off. It's sort of, instead of the traditional American missionary impulse, this is the impulse of the cloister, is where we seem to be headed. And I will stop there and turn it back over to Sandy.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm going to, before we go to the audience, I wanted to ask a few questions, just because I have the power of the chair. So we've been talking a lot about shifts in Washington, and especially what you were talking about, shifts in disposition in Washington and the way that we view China and U.S.-China policy. You were in China this summer,
Yes.
Robert, and you did a speaking tour for about 2 weeks, it was?
Yep.
You went all over China. And I was wondering if you got a feel there for the current debate in China on how they feel about China's U.S. policy. What are their views on America? I know this is an election lecture tour, so we were
Right.
mostly talking about Trump and Clinton.
Sort
But
of very, very
No doubt
quickly.
you tipped a Trump victory when you were there.
The
he's a mole.
I would say, I mean, the good news is, I'm having spent a month there and then recently 2 weeks right before the election, as has always been true. The Chinese are not remotely anti-American. None of that. I think that the goodwill at the popular level is alive and well. There is at the same time tremendous pride in China's own accomplishments and in China's growing power. There is a widespread belief that America is in irrevocable decline and that China is on the rise, and I think that plays into the views of the United States. But how they see American power vis-a-vis China's, China's pride is part of it, but people are also very conflicted about the direction China itself is taking. It's Chinese have their own version of the question that James Fallows is asking in his Atlantic piece, which I recommend to all of you, particularly among intellectuals, academics, journalists, the creative classes, independent thinkers, see a more, what in Chinese terms is a leftist or retrograde movement that there is deep concern about. And so they're conflicted, and they're also increasingly unwilling to have these conversations because they're afraid about what that retrograde movement combined with the anti-corruption campaign means for them. And so it's getting harder and harder to have these conversations. But I say that the bright spot is I don't really see anti-Americanism per se on the rise at all.
Are they happy with the way she is dealing with the United States, you find, or has that not even come up?
I didn't have those specific conversations most recently. I may have opinions about that, but it gets us a little bit off of today's topic. So I think I'll stop it there.
Okay. Okay, we'll open it up to the audience. There will be microphones coming around. Please identify yourself. And like I said, we are recording, so wait for the microphone. Gentleman in the back.
Stanley Kober, I'd like to challenge this optimistic assessment of the Chinese economy. A couple of weeks ago, the Bank of England published its financial stability report. The most significant risks to UK financial stability are global, it says. And it starts out with China. Growth in China is increasingly reliant on rapid credit expansion. Chinese non-financial sector debt currently stands at 260% of GDP. This is extraordinary leverage. And just today, the financial publication Barron's published on its website, title of the article, quote, "China's banks at risk amid bond sell-off," unquote. We have enormous capital flight now out of China. So, the pounds could respond to this.
Yeah, I don't think, I mentioned the economy, maybe I wasn't clear enough. I didn't think optimism about the Chinese economy. I merely said that they have the ability to maintain growth for at least the next year or two, maybe even beyond that. And I think I did say, and I perhaps should re-emphasize, that maybe this is just throwing good money after bad. It may be just pumping up the tires with more bad debt. It may be that in fact, it probably is. I mean, I think China will have a financial crisis at some stage. And I was just talking with a colleague here at the Wilson Centre who's sitting 2 rows in front of you, and I wish he could answer the question himself.
Hand Denny the mic.
But it is I mean, I don't underestimate the problems. By the same token, I'm not one of these sort of coming collapse of China people, because I think the Chinese understand these problems much better than we do. I think one area, though, and this is very on the downside for them, one of the big issues, for example, in the Western banking crisis, particularly in the US in 2008, 2009, is that once loans went bad, nobody knew where the collateral was or who owed the money, because it had all been divided up so many times, sliced and diced, that it wasn't easily to even fix a bad loan in that respect. And I think now, with the development in China of the wealth management products and all these sort of off-balance sheet items, that the complexity is not simply a matter anymore in China of the central government sort of stepping in with its massive financial resources and mopping it up, is that they will have trouble unwinding the complexity as well. In other words, so when there is a financial crisis, and there will be at some stage, it could be much worse than what many people expect. Anyway, that's a roundabout way of saying I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about China's problems, but I just simply don't think we're going to have a crisis in the immediate future, and certainly not in the sort of election year next year.
Right. Because I spoke good deal about China's economic power, so I want to speak briefly to that. It's a very important caveat. It's one of two sort of the big concerns about China. One is the economy, for the reasons that you mentioned, and the other are questions about the political system, which there's a lot of reason to think is fairly fragile, even though we have in many ways an increasingly strong country and a strong leader. It's clear that even that leader thinks that the system itself is fragile. So on the economy, I would sort of second Richard. Could there be a crisis? Yes. Could there be a political crisis? Yes. But sitting in Washington, my strategic assumptions, as I think about how to work with, and in some ways to work in spite of or against China in some fields, my strategic assumptions would be that for all of the economic difficulty, growth will slow, but they will muddle through, and growth will continue. And that for all of the fragility of the political system, that we have to assume that China remains under the sole leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So I agree, and it's a very important addition, but I just wouldn't make any strategic bets based on any kind of political or economic collapse scenario.
Did you want to add anything, Joanna?
No, that's fine.
Okay. We have the gentleman in the middle right there.
Hello. Hi, this is Zhu Xiaodi from the Emerson Foundation. I have one comment and question for Robert. Comment is that I'm really glad to hear your talk today, and it's really very sharp and penetrating, and your observations is great. Comment on this is that you mentioned about from the U.S. side about the sort of cultural security thing. On the other hand, in China, actually, they recently add cultural confidence to the 3 confidences.
Are there 3 confidences now?
Now,
There are 4 comprehensives,
now
3
4
confidences.
Yeah, 3 confidences.
Almost to the
before,
partridge
but
in the
now
pear tree.
4 confidences, because the 4th one is cultural confidence.
Cultural confidence.
Yeah. So the question for you is this: you talked about sort of U.S. Side. We have this belief or confidence in openness and all whatever, and now currently China seems to have this sort of closing door or backward or whatever. But in your term, for long term, do you believe when China becomes stronger and stronger, all their money, purchasing power, whatever, larger and larger, they would become truly confident, therefore become open again, or by nature, their culture is closed up or whatever. So no matter how they become stronger or have more purchasing power, they will stick with this sort of closing door, mindset. Or in the long run, when they become further, powerful or having more money or purchasing power, and then at certain point, they will become truly confident and become open again.
But I don't want to get into the long-term prophecy. We mostly want to be looking back, but it does seem to me maybe that you're conflating two different understandings of confidence. One, the way that Xi Jinping uses it, and then the way that we use it here, where we think that confidence is expressed in openness to criticism, openness to introspection, this sort of thing. Whereas I suspect that what they mean by cultural confidence coming out of the Xi lexicon is that it's a tool to stir nationalist sentiment, that the Chinese should be confident that China has a great culture in Chinese Communist Party terms and shouldn't doubt that or be down at mouth about it, for the same reason that they shouldn't be what she calls historical nihilists who question the Chinese government's interpretation of Chinese history, nor should they question the Ministry of Propaganda's and the Ministry of Culture's declarations about the greatness of culture. And that view of cultural confidence is quite different than a Western view that says a hallmark of confidence is openness. And so I'd be a little worried about conflating those two notions of confidence.
This woman right here.
Leah from VOA. I think we know the One China policy is the foundation of the U.S.-China relations, and now with that being questioned by the President-elect Trump, I'm just wondering if the panelists can venture into the predictions about where do you think the U.S.-China relations is heading to in next year?
Richard, you want to take it first?
Not at length. I mean, I think if, didn't Mr. Trump say in one of his follow-up tweets that he did support the One China policy, however he understands that? I think if it's genuinely under review, then I think relations are going into the deep freeze, however you judge who's right. I don't think internally in China they can start to let this unravel, and certainly not let it be sort of a negotiating, on the negotiating table with whatever the latest, trade demand is or something like that. So I think I would take China at its word that it would withdraw cooperation on any number of levels if the US wanted to put that back on the table. There are many people more expert on Taiwan than me, and you get all sorts of sort of Jesuitical sort of explanations of what the Shanghai Communique actually means, and whether it means whether the US does actually acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China, or simply there is one China, and that Taiwan and the PRC both acknowledge that. And there's no doubt been some sloppy language in the way that people have discussed that. I don't know whether what Mr. Trump really knew what he was doing, and whether it was part of a considered plan. But I'm of the view that he probably didn't know, as he said, until 2 hours or 3 hours beforehand that he was going to talk to Mrs. Tsai. I doubt he knew of the implications of that. And I would imagine that the most likely scenario, and of course I can't predict the future, is that once he got into office, he's more likely than not to dump Taiwan if he can do a bigger deal with China. And that would be the tragedy of the way he sort of trailed his coat so early on.
You want to add anything?
No, we go on to questions.
Okay. Let's do this gentleman right here.
Thank you. I'm Ben Lowson from the U.S. Navy. My question is for Professor Lewis. Is there a breaking point in China's climate and climate calamities? Is there a point where the people just won't put up with it and the government has to do something, or is it just going to be sort of a low-grade pressure?
Well, I think that, it's a good question. I think that the real issue, from the local population, it's not climate change per se, which is really a, global externality, but it's a lot of these co-issues which actually go along with the same sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which are the fossil energy sector, that are causing really bad air pollution. You hear about the airpocalypse that has been, actually it's really bad again the last few weeks, despite the fact that the last 3 years have been, an all-out policy push by the government to try to improve the air pollution situation. And so I think this is a real concern because they are sort of pulling all the policy levers that are kind of at Beijing's relatively easy reach. They've put moratoriums on building new coal plants in the air pollution attainment areas. They are, they've increased standards at all the emissions stacks. They're sort of doing what you can do. They're trying to encourage local officials to follow through on this, through promotion, incentive structures, things like this, right? But at the end of the day, things should be doing better now than they are, given everything I think that's been deployed over the last 3 years. And so, yes, I think the public's frustrated with this. I think you see it on social media. There's this, I think, feeling, and people that I talk to in China, where they're used to, making decisions about their day-to-day activities based on the PM 2.5 levels. And, if this is sort of the stage of development they're in, and in a few years they'll move out of it, and you have this expectation that it's going to get better and better, you get frustrated when you feel like for the last 3 to 4 years, there has not been a really tangible improvement. Even if you're getting microscopic improvements, you're not actually feeling that in your lungs. So I do think this frustration is a problem. I think that the leadership could be doing more, and I think that the question is, what is this tipping point that you mentioned? And people are already taking to the streets about environmental issues, among other issues. It's hard to sort of isolate them. It's hard to really understand whether the public obviously the public doesn't have the leverage we have here. There's courts are being used increasingly to try to legislate over failure to comply with environmental rules, and so that's also increasing in China. But again, with less sort of overall impact, I think, than we see in the United States, for example. So. I would hope that this is an issue that will be taken more seriously, because again, this has really, I would say, very little to do with sort of pressure from other countries and even the international agreements I mentioned earlier. This is really a domestic issue, and it's tied to, again, the broader economic reforms. I mean, China's coal use has gone down every year for the last 3 years, so on the whole, things are moving in the right direction. But then again, as you get this sort of slowing of the economy and the need to stimulate, you actually see incentives to get the coal plants running again, even though there's actually excess capacity. And so this is really the wrong direction. You've got, economic problems conflicting with environmental problems. This is not new. And so it really just depends where they want to really, use their leverage and push the levers at the local level.
This gentleman right here.
Thank you. My name is Arnold Zeitlin. I've been teaching in China. You mentioned this huge middle-class body has arisen in China. What is the significance of that politically? Is there a chance that opposition to a Communist Party policy will grow out of that group who want to protect their own assets?
Of course, this is an old question that we've been asking for several decades, and there's been a theory that the middle class would want to protect its own assets, that consumers, by letting people choose their dish soap, you foster a taste for choice, which eventually gets extended to politics. It hasn't really shown up yet, and this question has been under a microscope for a long time. My own view is that China has, deliberately or not, given itself a very smart safety valve, which speaks against the kind of middle-class uprising that has been forecast. And that uprising had a premise, which was that this middle class, which was making choices and wanted to protect assets, was somehow walled in to the repressive country that was being considered. But the Chinese middle class, is not. Over 100 million of them travel overseas as tourists every year. They can go overseas to study. They can send their children overseas to study. They can buy properties elsewhere. And they can do very well with this. And so I think it becomes a valve for this kind of discontent. And this is purely anecdotal, but from the really fairly large number of wealthy middle-class Chinese that I know, they will go to Thailand once a year, and they will go to Paris, and they will come to the United States, and they have a nice house in Vancouver, and their children are at private schools in the United States. They travel when they want, and then they go back to their home country where they really like the food much better than they do here, and where they make their money, and where they have their friends, and they're not stuck there. And so that dissatisfaction comes with real benefits, and they have other channels for expressing their need for freedoms or whatever it may be. And so that, again, whether that's deliberate or not, it acts as a pressure release valve such that you don't see this building middle class resentment that has been so long forecast. Does that mean it'll never come? I have no idea. It's not around the corner.
I might add to that, I think many people might think in the so-called middle class, by pressing for political rights, they might endanger their livelihood.
Right.
Not individually and broadly. In other words, they think the calculation is the system has delivered enough for them now that to really rock the boat politically could have the opposite effect, not securing their future, but the opposite. I mean, but I'm like Robert, I have no idea what will happen in 10 years.
In the middle, right there. Yep, you're in the same row.
Hi, Phil Schrafer, retired international healthcare worker. I believed after Trump's last tweet that the one China was negotiable. I think the Chinese leader said that he's reading at a child's level. Question: I understand that the U.S. Navy, in particular, has gotten rather good relationships with the Chinese Navy. And given a Trump regime with so many military leaders and so on, wouldn't this be a channel of communication to improve the relationship between the two countries?
Richard?
I think navies, I'm not an expert here, there's probably many more people expert in the room. Navies generally think they can run the world. You know, they talk to sailors, sailor to sailor, admiral to admiral, they can work it out. I don't think that's the case. You look at Admiral Harry Harris, I don't think he's getting on too well with his Chinese counterparts. The idea, I think, that a government of, in fact, the Chinese really dislike Harry Harris, and make a fetish of the fact that he's half Japanese, and have always looked at the White House to constrain him, and some would argue that's exactly what's happened. In general, the idea that a bunch of generals in the government here can get on with a bunch of generals in China, I don't think so either. Actually, there's too much strategic competition there, and I don't see General Michael Flynn as being particularly diplomatic in that respect. Mathis maybe. But I don't know. I mean, what is striking so far about there's many striking things about the incoming administration, but from our perspective is there's very little Asia expertise at all. And I don't think we have a good signal on policy towards Asia. And of course, Mr. Trump's main emphasis has been on trade. That could go, and maybe the strategic side will come back into it. But I'm not I still think the US and China in many respects are on a collision course. The good thing, of course, is they both know they are and learn to manage it.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I
You agree
associate
100%.
myself with the remarks of my colleague.
Gentleman right there.
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Chris. Earlier this fall, I was able to attend a dinner in New York along with 500 or so of my closest friends in honor of Li Keqiang. And one of the things that was really striking to me was after his prepared remarks, when he was on stage with probably about 100 or so people who had paid very handsomely, I think, for the honor, he huddled together with Dr. Kissinger for about 20 minutes and then walked right out the door. And I'm wondering, again, given the fact we're here at the Kissinger Institute, his name is hovering in the background as I watch here. I'm curious if there's anything you can share to help me understand the role, the singular role Kissinger has played in the Obama administration in the bilateral relationship, how that role may have been different from the role he had played in other post-government service administrations, and specifically, I mean, given the moment right now when my understanding is there's no shortage of people who are trying to jump into the vacuum that's been created by Trump's election to serve as some sort of conduit between, old Chinese friends and the incoming administration. I know we're looking backward, but if there's anything you can share about what his role might be in the future.
Well, it's a little off topic for today. I'd be happy to have an email exchange with you. I have no particular insight into that, except that I think that his role was probably somewhat diminished under the Obama administration over the past 8 years. But he continues to consult at the highest levels in both countries. I think it's because he always takes a very long historic view of relations, because he understands the foundation of the relationship, which he helped to create, namely the one China policy. And because he believes always in keeping the relationship on as constructive and respectful a footing as possible. And so he continues to have a voice. Beyond that, I wouldn't care to go much further, but shoot me an email if you want, and I may add a few more thoughts.
Let's go to this woman right here.
Hello, my name is Marina Rudenko. I'm from Ukraine, and Ukraine fortunately is benefit from China economic diplomacy, as Richard mentioned. We have a lot of investment in Ukrainian economy, especially agriculture. But I have questions related China, Russia, and the United States relationship. In case U.S. will build more friendship relationship with Russia despite war in Ukraine, could you please kindly predict U.S.-China relationship in such case? Because on my mind, Russia has a great challenge because of China people migration to the far east of Russia, and it's a great challenge which is not recognized officially by Russia. So what is your prediction related such?
No prediction at all. There is a theory in China, and it's been written about here in the United States as well. I have no idea whether Russians are putting this forward, but that maybe Trump will have a tendency to want to sort of play the Russia card against China, much as Nixon played the China card against the Soviet Union. In other words, a warming up to Putin that would sort of isolate China and flip what we've seen as a growing Beijing-Moscow entente. Really, at this point, this is just sheer speculation. People are exaggerating, people are having fun, people are fearful. There simply is no real information to go on. Obviously, Russia, Sino-U.S. relations are going to be very important, but we have no real data points upon which to make a prediction like that. I don't think we'd have it yet.
I could say, obviously Russia and China at the top level have made an enormous effort really for 10 years now to build closer relations. I'm not sure that extends into a trusting relationship between the two peoples. You alluded to the Far East, and I think probably paranoia in the Russian Far East about sort of, being populated, the Chinese taking over there at some stage. Deng Xiaoping, I think, famously complained bitterly about what the Soviet Union then took after the war. He said they took 16 Jiangsus from us or something like that from memory. So I still think there's a residue of deep suspicion there. And I'm not a Russia expert, but you can see that the Russians, I think, don't want to be dependent on the Chinese. Mr. Putin is in Japan today. I don't know whether they're going to get a deal on the Northern Islands, but I think they're going to do a lot of things, and perhaps on the energy front. So depending on how Mr. Trump and what happens in Washington, perhaps to a degree, you wonder whether the closeness of the Russians and the Chinese won't not fracture, but they'll be looking for other options besides just themselves.
Okay, we only have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to take a few questions and we'll do a lightning round. This gentleman right here in the tie.
Thank you very much. I'm Jackie Yu from Santa DC. My question is to Dr. Lewis. In the last couple of days, we saw names like Rex Tillerson and Rick Perry. So to give us an impression that your next cabinet could be a little bit pro-fossil fuel. And my question to Dr. Lewis is that do you think there will be possibly be a change or a shift of focus for China-U.S. energy cooperation in the next 4 years? And how much sincerity and willingness do you believe that from both countries they will continue the cooperation and talk on issues like climate change or the implementation of Paris Accord? Thank you.
Thank you. And then the one in the back.
Jim.
Jim Feinerman from Georgetown Law. I had a question about education in the United States. We've become very dependent at a number of institutions on a large body and a growing body over the last decade or so of students from the PRC. And on the one hand, we believe, maybe flatter ourselves, that this will heighten our cultural influence in the next generation of Chinese. But at the same time, it exposes vulnerability that if China decides to direct its students to go elsewhere or discourage them from studying in the United States, that it could have a serious downturn effect on a number of American educational institutions.
Okay, we'll take one more. This gentleman right here in the red.
We've heard a lot, even today in the newspaper, about President Xi's concern expressed in China about the expression of Western values. Following up on Richard's comment, are we likely to hear something about a concern issued over here about Chinese values?
Okay. Do you want to go first, Joanna?
Sure. Well, I think it's an interesting question, and again, you know, it's hard to speculate, but I would point out, I guess, that using the data points we have, right? So, I mean, Exxon has said they're in support of the Paris Agreement historically. So, I think that that's actually, you know, a lot of large companies, including fossil fuel companies, want certainty and stability in the regulatory front. So, I think, you know, more damaging than impending climate change regulation is uncertainty about when and if, and you know, and of course, you know, a company like Exxon operates across many countries around the world, not just in the United States. They're already facing carbon pricing in Europe and other places. So again, it's this sort of hodgepodge of regulations in many ways, which is more challenging, I think, for companies. So, you know, whether this sort of private sector, you know, push towards some kind of clarity and certainty, at least around the future of carbon pricing and climate policy, you know, that could influence a Trump administration, but I think it's too early to say. I think in terms of, you know, whether if there are shifts in the bilateral space, and I'm sure there will be with sort of new priorities of a new Secretary of Energy, Secretary of State, you know, will this affect the domestic context? And I think in China, probably not much, honestly, because China is, you know, again, almost everything they're doing bilaterally with the United States is because it is helping what they want to do domestically. It's in their interest. And, you know, China has announced that they are going to be launching the largest carbon market in the world starting next year. I don't see them changing their stance on that just because of a U.S. president. I think that there's a lot of challenges that China's facing in implementing a carbon market like that, but I think that it's one piece of their overall strategy. And I think that it's actually, you know, this is maybe somewhat counterintuitive. You know, China's going to be a difficult place to have an effective carbon market. It's not a purely market economy. There's a lot of data issues which are coming to light in the early stages of the pilot markets, but actually, based on the people I talked to in the last few months on the ground who are helping to implement this program, you actually see the carbon market being used to help sort of push industrial restructuring because this is, again, it's one of the few policy levers that the government has over these energy-intensive industries to try to make them more efficient and then, again, incentivize new clean energy sectors. So I don't see that changing in China. In the U.S., you know, there are certainly things that, you know, the EPA and others can do to to try to slow down a lot of the policies that the Obama administration implemented. But, I think a 180 would be challenging.
Thank you. Robert?
Jim, on education, I mean, you're sort of more in the belly of the beast now than I am, so I'd love to hear your views on it. But I think that the Chinese government sees itself as having derived such tremendous benefit from sending students to the United States over the past 30 years, from those who return to China, from those who don't. They continue to see that as a major channel for knowledge, for innovation, for training. So that unless we were to really undermine the relationship fundamentally, for example, by pushing the notion that the one China policy is a bargaining chip. I mean, to question or to reject the one China policy, this is to break relations with the PRC. That's what we're talking about when we start playing around with this as the foundation. Then, of course, it would dry up. Otherwise, because the government gets such high benefit and because the demand from the Chinese people is so strong, I don't think they would tinker with it at the margins. I'm not even sure that they could at this stage. And then lastly, on sort of Chinese values, I think the concern is more with Chinese standards and Chinese practices. As mentioned, standards for technology, practices in censorship, this sort of thing. China has not articulated a set of Chinese values that it wishes to export. There is a list, actually, of a very clear list of the Chinese core values, the Hexin Jiazhiguan, which is on billboards all over China, and it's freedom and love and democracy and goodness is better than badness because it's nicer, and it just doesn't have a lot of profound exportable quality there.
I might say just in 2 seconds on the education thing, it's not just I agree with Rob, but it's not just the US, it's the UK, it's where I'm from, Australia. I think Australia's probably pumped up a little bit more on full fee-paying students than the US is. But on the other hand, the UK, going through its Brexit moment, I saw the other day they're potentially cutting the number of student visa places, which will also affect the universities big time as well. And I think it'd be a very drastic, something really drastic for them the Chinese to actually stop. If you're in China and you get into an American university, you can go. You don't need permission from your government. And so it would be a very drastic thing for that to be cut off by mandate.
Okay, lastly, if you guys could suggest one book to President-elect Trump to read about Asia or China, what would that be? Robert?
Trump, but really to all of you.
Yeah, everybody.
Pomfret's latest, The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, is sort of the history of sort of what we've been talking about, of cultural, trade, educational, mutual influence between the United States and China. A lot of great stories, and it makes the point that, alarmed as we are right now, there's really nothing new under the sun. This relationship has always been characterized by mutual fascination and frustration. Good stuff. John Pomfret. The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom.
Richard?
Gosh, I don't know. That's the book at the moment. There is
I just made a trite, obvious decision. Then,
yeah, well, no, but if you look back and this is, I know I'll be skiting here. If you look on the internet, and there's a list of Donald Trump's top 10 books on China, and mine is number 1, and Henry Kissinger is number 2. Clearly he hasn't read any of them, but that's my best guide.
Well, he's listening, I'm sure. Joanna?
Right, aside from all of our books, of course. Yeah. I think that, there's actually a new book out, just came out, called The Economics of Air Pollution in China, written by Ma Jun, not Ma Jun the activist, Ma Jun the chief economist at the...
It was featured in our monthly newsletter last year.
Oh, great, yeah. No, and I've just started reading it. It's on my desk. But, it's an interesting perspective, right? Because this is a finance guy, really, who's looking at, again, these sort of the challenges that the government has in enforcing air pollution policy in China and suggesting some new ideas. So I think, it's a good sort of Chinese perspective on the ground of what's happening.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And before I would like to end, I would like to thank the rest of the Kissinger Institute staff, Ms. Ray Zhong, Ting Yizhu. I know how tedious and thankless this job is because I used to do it. So thank you so much for the whole year. 谢谢. Happy New Year and happy holidays.